holistic way. He also coordinates digitalization research within the university. Prior to his PhD at the same university, he worked for CSTEP, a non-profit policy research organization in India and in the software industry. He has over 10 years of experience in building models, small and large, covering simulations, games, and artificial intelligence, and in applying them in real-world decision-making settings. I once again welcome to Dr. Jayant Ragothama and request him to please start the session.
Thanks. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm Indian for sure. I don't know about the eminent part. But I'm honored to be invited in this amazing webinar series, and I hope I can keep you all engaged with what I have to say. So I've titled this talk, Designing Simulation Games, Trade-offs between Realism, Fidelity, and Abstraction. And I will mostly be talking about abstraction today. So this talk is basically a reframing of another one that I gave for the ISAGA Summer School a couple of years ago. And there have been, so I was going through the sort of the other webinars on YouTube, and I was kind of stuck on what to say, because there have been so many excellent experts before me. And hopefully by now, they've convinced you that simulation gaming is a great method. And I'm sure they've covered like systems and complex systems and Duke's methods and so on, right? So I didn't want to go over all of that again. And I was really kind of in a muddle as to what to talk about. So we call our field simulation gaming, simulation and gaming, gaming simulation, and so on. So there are like many variations of this theme. And to be sure, we do both. So we do simulations and we do games. And I want to kind of, in today's talk, I want to separate the two different aspects. Nearly all of us in this field do both. I would hazard a guess to say there are more gamers than simulationists. But I think nearly everyone in this field kind of does both. There is plenty of theory from simulation that we can use, and there are a lot of best practices from game design. And what I want to do is to unpack the relationship between, let's say, simulations and games. And by simulations, I mostly mean computer-based software simulations that have a core underlying model derived from scientific theory, right? So I have a very specific definition of simulations for this talk. And I hope that by sort of examining the two components separately and the relationship that they have with each other, I hope that will give a better insight on how we can design more effective games. A brief bit of my background. So why do I want to talk about this kind of relationship? So my core training and background is as a computer scientist. So I studied in IIIT Bangalore for my master's, and then I worked in a think tank there, and then in the software industry. So my core expertise is in computer science. But I mostly applied that in public policy in India, and then in Europe. So I've been doing sort of games and simulations since about 2009 almost, not as long as many other experts here, but still fairly long. And now I work and live in Stockholm at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. So before we begin, let's start with a short story. This short story is called The Seventh Sally. It's part of an epic called Siberiad from Stanislaw Lem, written a long time ago in 1965. And it's a story about two supernatural godlike engineers. They go around creating worlds. One of them is called Trull, and one day Trull is traveling in space and finds a man living alone on an asteroid, right? So the man is a king, and he has been overthrown by his subjects. So this despot is obviously sad, and he asks Trull to reinstate him as ruler over his subjects. But Trull is both, kind and smart, so he doesn't want to reinstate him as a despot, but he also wants the despot to not be sad anymore. So he finds a technological solution, a hack. He creates a hyper-realistic simulation of a kingdom that fits in a box, and he gives this box to this despot. So the despot can now abuse these simulated subjects without hurting anybody real, right? So all of this connected, mounted, and ground to precision fit into a box, and not a very large one, but just one that could be carried around with ease. So this Trull presented to Excelsius to rule and to have dominion over forever. But first he showed where the input and how to program wars, quell rebellions, etc., right? So Trull basically creates an interactive simulation that can be manipulated like a game. The story is, so Stanislaw Lem intends the story as, a satire of totalitarianism. After giving this box, Trull goes away and comes back, many years later, and he finds that Excelsius has been killed and overthrown by his virtual citizens. The little civilization breaks out of the box and colonizes the entire asteroid. So this is, to me, this is like this is a perfect story for for us simulation gamers, and to me, it's also like a warning to us not to take ourselves too seriously, and to be careful about how realistic and how abstract we want to be with our games. Like I said, I want to unpack the sort of relationship between games and simulations. And to me, the big difference between the two components is abstraction and fidelity. And I will go into, well, mostly abstraction and fidelity a little bit later on. So what do we mean when we say abstraction? It indicates the removal of something, right? Most board games are usually abstract. Most electronic games are not. But abstraction is basically how players connect the game mechanics and the dynamics to the theme and content of the game, right? So abstraction is basically how you would choose to represent certain aspects of the model, certain aspects of reality, or certain aspects of the story, of the narrative, whatever. How do you represent that in the game through mechanics, through artifacts, etc. But basically, abstraction relates more to the game design rather than the simulation itself. And abstraction is basically how you as a game designer can curate the player experience. How can you lead the player through the aspects that you want him or her to experience, right? Abstraction is how you communicate complex concepts. Abstraction is how you can obscure something, how you can elevate something, depending on what you want the player to experience and achieve, right? But oftentimes in literature, we talk about abstraction as a property of the game, but it is also a very important sort of lever to design the game. So it is something that a game designer can actively use to elevate or diminish the player experience. And it is a key sort of design mechanism. And others, I think, have talked already about how you would kind of structure the game into roles, resources, rules, etc. And when you're kind of trying to design a game, these are the main things that you can abstract in or abstract out, right? So you can have different abstractions for rules, for the fictional world that the player is in, for the agency that the player has, the roles that he or she can take, the resources, and so on. And I will sort of walk through different dimensions of these aspects. So these are, I think, familiar to everyone. This is Pac-Man. This is a game called Qbert, an obscure little video game. This is, of course, Tetris, right? So these are fairly abstract video games. The rules and the fictional world and the mechanics are pretty simple, right? So the control in Tetris is just 4 keys, same in Pac-Man, same in Qbert. But the difference is Tetris has a fairly weak fictional world. The other 2 games have a fairly strong one, right? But they're still fairly abstract in their design, as in, the mechanics are simple. You only have one thing to do, 2 things to do in Tetris. Similarly, 2 objectives in Pac-Man and so on. More kind of abstractions. So I don't know how many are familiar. This is a very neat little game that I used to love playing called 140. So this is similar to, so the game is very similar to the mechanics in Mario, Super Brothers and so on, not Mario Kart. The player is a very simple, abstract, rectangular shape. So it's a triangle, circle, square, rectangle. It can change. It is very visually abstract. So those are the only shapes that you will see. But the game relies on sort of musical synchronization to help orient you. So as long as you're going fluently through the game, the music is very smooth and it kind of builds up in tempo and crescendo. But if you fall or if you hurt yourself as a triangle or a square, then it becomes very discordant, right? So then there are more jarring notes. So the music helps you orient how you're playing and how fluent you are. And this is another one. It's called The Brothers of Us, and it's kind of like a puzzle game. So the 2 brothers, older and younger, are trying to find their father in like a lost world. The setting and the brothers are all, the animation, etc., is fairly, well, not realistic, but really good. But the controls are not. So the typical controls that you would use, like joystick or arrow keys or WASD and so on, those are not there. So you have to kind of move them using like puppetry controls. And through that mechanism, you have to become very, very familiar with the character that you're playing. So you can alternate between the 2 brothers, but you have to become really familiar with sort of their properties to be able to control them well, all right? And these are, again, 2 different levels of abstraction. So one is in sort of the aesthetic, but it gives you a very powerful sort of experience using multiple senses. The other one, you have to become really, really, because it abstracts out some key familiar controls, you have to become really immersed into the game to be able to play it well, right? So these are kind of how you would use different abstractions, whether it's in the narrative, whether it's in the rules, whether it's in the fictional world, or different aspects to give and curate different experiences for the player. But how does that kind of apply to us as, game designers or modelers in the real world, dealing with more complex and more serious subjects? I'm sure everybody is kind of familiar with this or have heard of or played this a lot. So this SimCity was created by Will Wright in 1999. And he designed it as like, a software toy. It introduced these mechanics that are familiar to a lot of game designers now. So this kind of tilted isometric view, the grid system, the underlying computational models, and the greenfield approach. So you basically start from an empty grid and you can design and build your city. And SimCity became really popular with planners and architects and game designers, and people started using it in education, in kind of planning and so on. But the underlying models are cooked up. So it comes from, it's fairly complex, and there is this game layer, but there is also like an underlying computational model that drives many of the game dynamics. And during my PhD, what we thought was, okay, how about what would you do if you want to sort of if you want to support decision making and planning at this kind of level, at a very detailed, at a very operational level, but how would you do that in a very real world setting? So we went and built what we call ProtoWorld. So this is a game that came out of my PhD. It's basically a framework that's capable of developing very complex simulation games of mostly urban cities, right? So basically, we take a fairly realistic, pre-built, scientifically validated simulation that is in use currently. So it is a simulation called Sumo and a few others on top of that. So the simulations are very realistic. They simulate and model realistic phenomena of movement of cars, of pedestrians, of bikes, public transport, and so on. So we calibrate that to real cities, to wherever we want to play the game in, and then you play the game similar to SimCity. So you can take on the role of the transport planner or the urban planner, and you can change traffic lines, you can add cars, buses, etc. So it's a fairly it's not a simple game like SimCity. It's not a hyper realistic simulation like what Trull built, but it goes very close to depicting very real world phenomena very accurately, but giving some abstract controls to the gameplay, right? So this is like the underlying model. So what you're seeing is basically public transport metro in Rome. These are the different metro stations, and these are the people going about in trains or in buses and so on. So this is the kind of editor mode. You can play the game like this. So you can control different lines, you can change where people should go, etc., etc. Quite a few controls. You can close stations, open lines, add buses, remove cars, etc. So this only shows people and movements and metros and so on, right? But the game can also look like this. This is the actual city of Rome. And it's exactly the same underlying model. It's exactly the same lines, the same infrastructure, but now it is represented a little bit more clearly. The people are still dots. They're still moving around without any animation. The buildings are still squares, and they're not actual. We don't have the actual Colosseum, etc. But there is more in this version than in the previous one, and you can extend it a little bit more. So this is the city of Paris. We are kind of simulating a terrorist attack, weirdly and in a very dark way. This is the exact scenario where the attacks in Paris happened in 2014. So it's the same stadium, it's the same scenario that the police asked us to kind of simulate. And what you can see here is, contrary to the previous two screens, it's the same engine. People are, moving about. They have actual movement. They're animated in a much more realistic sense. So you can see them swinging their arms or driving cars, etc. So the shapes, etc., are as realistic as we can get it to be. So these are three different sort of abstractions over the same engine and the same model. In one, it is very simple. You only look at what you need for the game. In another one, there is more detail. There is more buildings. You can actually see the dynamics play out in Rome, as it were. And this one is a bit more compressed. The third one is a bit more compressed, but again, it has more and more elements in it, right? So more has been abstracted in than out. So this is again, so there is the game element and there is the computational model behind it. But if you were to only look at, the game element, it could also look a little bit like this. So this is a variation. This is the city game. I think Eric talked a little bit about it in his webinar. This was originally developed by Dr. Portugali, and what it does is, so Dr. Portugali is a very eminent researcher in Tel Aviv, Israel, and has a long legacy of city games. So what he does is he abstracts out the urban planning process and represents it in simple wooden blocks. So the blocks could mean literally anything that you want. So it could be like a market as shown here. It could be, I think, slums here, an industrial sector. It could be apartments. It can mean anything that you want it to, a road, whatever, right? And he starts with a greenfield approach, similar to SimCity, but here the focus is on the players and what they want to build and how they imagine the city, right? So we again took a similar approach. I think this was played in the TED conference in Mysore. I'm not really sure, but this is the city game. This is an urban planning game. Everybody is given a bunch of resources, like basically a pile of wooden blocks, and they can put down whatever they want. They can build the city that they want to live in. And it can tend to look, and then you can sort of visualize it in this fashion. And what you can do then is you can take this city that people have built and plug in the sort of computational model in ProtoWorld. In ProtoWorld, we use current existing cities like Stockholm or Berlin or Rome or something, but you can also sort of build and simulate your you can also build and simulate your, the city that you have designed in a participatory fashion. Again, so starting from SimCity to ProtoWorld to sort of the city game, you have different levels of abstraction. You have abstracted in different things, removed certain things. SimCity and ProtoWorld are both sort of single player games. They focus on how the city functions, how the city behaves. So the focus there is more on the computational model underneath. When you abstract out, when you remove that sort of computer simulation away, you can focus on what people want rather than how the city functions, right? So this is how the city game kind of looks like. And there are variations on this. So you can take the same city game concept and reduce it down to a neighborhood. So this is a game called Squares. It again came from Jerusalem, built by two architects. And here they take a very similar approach. So the mechanics are the same. A group of people around a table designing or modifying an existing neighborhood. And the artifacts again are very simple. It's a grid-based approach similar to SimCity. The things that you use to build are again very abstract. It's just basically circles and rectangles and squares. But they represent different things. So what these different levels of abstraction do is basically they force the player to think about different things. They are curating the player experience in different ways. ProtoWorld and SimCity forces you to think about how cars move or what the consequences of actions are. The city game forces you to think about what you want and how you react to what others want, right? So how you build a collective vision. So the way the artifacts are designed, the way the way you get people to interact with the artifacts, with the game rules, etc., force the game into different trajectories. This is again the city game in a slightly more detailed manner. This is Ekim Tan's Play the City game. So again, she's taken exactly this game basically and added different abstractions to it. So these things represent different things: apartment blocks in different shapes, companies in different shapes, buildings in different shapes with different functions. So these are parks. Anybody who knows Dutch can help me out with the translation, but basically they're all the things that a city should have, right? And again, the abstraction sort of level is a bit different here. She's actually designed the shapes for you, or at least designed enough shapes so that you can sort of build it in a way that you really want. In this one, you have to imagine how you want it to be. Here, you don't really have to imagine so much. So you can actually take a very abstract greenfield city game and apply it in a very realistic, well, not realistic, but you can apply it to the neighborhood that you already know and recognize. So that's what this game does. And then she, of course, adds like governance and policies and so on to this. But as you can see, the representation has changed and evolved from a neighborhood, from a neighborhood to a larger sort of mid-sized city. And this is the transport mobility game. Eric is here. I don't know if I've named it properly. The picture came from him very kindly. And again, it's sort of a very similar game. We're talking about a city, we're talking about a neighborhood. Here, Eric is talking about mobility, and he's basically using, I think, paper strips and duct tape to represent roads, and simple circles to represent junctions and so on. All right. So again, here is another layer of abstraction over more or less the same artifact or the same underlying system, but it forces the players to focus on the aspects that you want. So if Eric had buildings, it would have been a slightly different experience for the players. And I think people know this. This is Minecraft, similar approach. But again, what Minecraft does is it's really clever. So it basically says, okay, I'm going to take the same city game, but I'm not going to give you different shapes. I'm just going to give you a square, and you can build whatever you want with that square. All right. So Minecraft abstracts out the resources that you would have. You don't have factories, you don't have apartments, you don't have buildings, you don't have cars, you don't have a simulation underneath. You just have one square to play with. And that's pretty much it, right? So the only thing left is how vivid the player's imagination is. This is kind of like the spectrum that we have. All of these are city games, SimCity to Proto World to the actual city game. There's no better name for it. To Squares, to Play the City, to the transport game from Eric. They're all abstracting the same underlying phenomenon. So it's the urban form that we're talking about. It's the city dynamics. So in some abstractions, it's easier to change rules. So for example, in the city game, it's easier to change. It's a turn-based game. So people take it in turns to build something, to represent something, and so on. In others, it's easier to change the narrative. So in Minecraft, it's easier to change the story. It's easier to change what these things mean. Here, Eric has already explained. In Play the City, it's very easy to change what this looks like. It's easy to change governance structures and so on, right? So depending on your level of abstraction, it's easier to change some aspects of the game design rather than others. So this again is kind of easier to do with board and paper-based games. It's kind of harder to do with computer simulations. And the reason is, well, first of all, it's hard to change a computer simulation. But it also has to do with kind of this reason, with fidelity, especially with sort of SimCity and ProtoWorld. They are more realistic. They have a certain aspect of fidelity to them that the other 4 games do not. And it's because what Jay Forrester explained very, very well. A two-way street runs between mental models and computer models. So mental models contribute much of the input for computer models, and from these simulations comes new insight, all right? So this is a very nice framing of why we need fidelity in computer simulations. But what does that actually mean for a player? So when you confront a player with a computer simulation, like in SimCity or in ProtoWorld, you're actually forcing the player to reverse engineer the model, mostly by trial and error. So you're forcing the player to interpret the model, and the player has to deduce the designer's assumptions starting from their own assumptions. So if you are given SimCity, and if it's like a Martian city with no gravity, then it very quickly becomes bizarre and weird, and the game experience for the player is very difficult, right? So if you're saying this is a city game and there's a computer simulation, then there has to be certain assumptions that make sense to the player. If it's a board game or if it's a paper-based game, depending, even with sufficient layers of abstraction within them, it's easier to kind of change these assumptions. It's easier to change these artifacts, the mental models, and so on, because you mostly have a lot of space within the players to be able to do that. So with sort of computer games, when you have computer games, when you have simulations, realistic simulations underneath, you cannot really be too imaginative and too counterintuitive. You have to try to align with the most common assumptions. So for example, if you had an industry, you create jobs. If you had a police station, you reduce crime. If you close a metro station, you cause crowding. If you add more cars, it becomes dense and pollution and so on, right? So you have to match, when you're sort of adding more and more software simulations, you have to match your assumptions with the player's assumptions, or risk the game getting broken. And why? And this again goes back to, I think, what Sebastian talked a little bit about in his first lecture. Models kind of mediate, and here this model can mean can be either a game model or a computer simulation. So models can they kind of act as a mediator between theory and reality. We can ignore theory a little bit for this talk, but they are kind of mediating between us and the reality that they are trying to represent, right? So this has to be fidelitous. So there has to be certain fidelity. But if you're giving that model to an actor, here you can add, at this link, you can add a little bit of your abstraction. So this representation has to be fairly fidelitous. This sort of interaction and interface along this line, you can try to abstract in or abstract out whatever you want. And that depends on kind of like your purpose. What do you want the players to experience? What do you want the players to understand? And so on. So even if you have a hyper-realistic computer simulation, you can still kind of choose what the players get to play with. For example, in ProtoWorld, there is literally the entire city to play with, but depending on the scenario, we give them, close a metro line, change a metro line, add buses and so on. In certain other things, we can give them sort of more chairs to play with. How many bikes do you start with? How many people choose to walk? What is the sort of boundary of the city, and stuff like that. So there is literally hundreds of options, but you have to choose what the players have to play with. And you have to choose whether it's a green field, whether you add buildings, whether you add animation, etc. So those are the kind of different abstraction levers that you as a game designer have. And then you need to choose depending on your purpose. And the central question with both of these sort of aspects is basically comes down to these two things. So as a game designer, you constantly have to ask, or as a simulationist, you constantly have to ask, do your players identify with the model? Can they sort of recognize it? And as a game player, can your players interpret the dynamics within the model, right? So can they understand the model behavior? Can they understand the consequences and so on? Can they make that mental leap between their mental model and the model that you are presenting to them? And as a modeler, you always have to kind of ask, so what are you trying to abstract? Abstraction of which object, and fidelity to basically how much realism. So these are the kind of like the two sort of levers, these are the two aspects. So which object are you trying to bring into the game? Which object can you throw out? How realistic, or fidelity to how much realism? How much do you want to represent in the game, in the simulation, and so on? And some final reflections over this. So abstraction, again, like I said, it's not only a property of the game, it is a key design lever. And as you know, you have to kind of use it. So avoid greenfield godlike games. SimCity like games don't really work. You need to bring in context, and you have to use abstraction to kind of curate the player's experience. You can use pre-built models for computer simulations like we do in Proto World. They give you credibility and scientific validity. And I think as a discipline, we sit in the middle of game design and simulation. There's a lot of very rich and rigorous theory from simulation that we can use, that we shouldn't ignore. And video game and entertainment gaming, they know how to design games really, really well. What our discipline does well is to bring those two worlds together, and we should use it. And that's basically all I had today. And as usual, I finished way too early. I'm sorry about that, but it's kind of a habit I need to break. Any questions?
Thank you so much, sir. I request panel members to please ask the questions if you have, and I request other participants from the student group also to write their questions in the chat box.
Thanks for the nice presentation. Actually, sir, can we this abstraction, can we use this phenomena during the development of our models from theory to model?
Yes and yes and no. So you certainly there's an aspect of abstraction in sort of developing simulations as well, but it kind of depends on. That is mostly a property of, I think, practicality to a certain extent. So how much can you actually simulate, and how much can you add into your models before you can no longer validate it. So if you're only talking about sort of models and simulations in a classical sense. It's practical constraints that mostly drive your abstraction. You can certainly abstract out natural laws, for example. You don't need to include gravity in your models. But if you're really talking about sort of policy questions or social models or agent-based models, then you have to be a little bit careful. And I think similar principles apply. I was being a bit simplistic in saying abstraction only applies to the game design and not to computer simulations. Of course, there is boundaries between them and sort of gray areas. But I think, especially because we as a discipline talk about sort of including players and interacting with participants and with participation, then similar principles that you would use for sort of curating the player's experience, you can use that for developing your simulation models as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Now I invite Dr. Elizabeth to ask the question or any comment on the presentation.
Well, I was interested in the question from Gopali Rana about, and I'm not sure if Jayant has seen it.
No, I haven't yet. I'm looking at the chat now.
I would like to read the questions. Read the question from Kripali Rana. One
Sure.
of the.
Yes, thank you for the session. I need to know, if we want to start a game, the game development, then how to decide the appropriate model for that, which is kind of part of what you were talking about in terms of abstraction, but a bit to one side. So I suppose my question would be, how do you make decisions? How do you make decisions about the relationship between abstractions and particular models?
So this again, I think is a little bit of my bias, but again, I'm still separating out sort of the gaming aspect with sort of the computer simulation. So if I have to build a software simulation or a computational model, I will always look at literature and theory to see if there is something out there. Even if it's an equation or a description of something, then that's where I would start. So with certainly a lot of domains, there is pre-built software that you can kind of try to use and plug into your game development. If there is nothing, then you're kind of relying on, I think, experience and best practices. So choose elementary principles, keep it simple, and always start with the question that you have and with the kind of player group that you have. So for example, with Proto World, what happened was we gave them like the blank map that we had. And so we were playing, I'm going to go back to that slide a little bit. So we were actually playing this game with sort of metro controllers in Rome. And we gave them this map and they kind of freaked out a little bit because they did not recognize it at all. They were much more comfortable with this one because this is what they recognize and this is what they see on a daily basis. So it really depends to a large extent on kind of what your player group recognizes, what are they used to seeing, and can you match your model to that one? People who deal with more abstract questions on a strategic level are more used to sort of abstract representations like this one. People at the operational level kind of need operational level details. So if you give police officers this kind of map to play with, it will not go down very well because they're used to seeing physical people, they're used to seeing body dynamics, they're used to seeing realistic expressions and so on. So you have to match your model to what the players are used to on a daily basis. If you can't do that, then you're in a bit of a bother.
I agree with you, and I think that in both simulations and games are exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
They both use levels of abstraction in exactly the same ways. It's and those things that you've mentioned for me are
Mm-hmm.
the same things: the participants, the context, the complexity of the issue that you're trying to represent, and so on. They're all part of it. And I can see Elena's put a message in the questions too, so I'll ask her question unless she'd like to. She's asked, what's your personal definition of game? And I also of simulation, and then of model.
Oh God. Okay. So
That should
depending. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, depending on the context or depending on the problem, I kind of use multiple definitions. So Jesper Joule's definition is something that I use a lot. I don't recall it off the top of my head, because that's kind of more concrete. And I'm today blanking out the illusory definition. I'm kind of blanking out on the name. That's also something that I kind of use to orient myself. And otherwise, it's mostly, I try to go by the construct. So the rules, the roles, the resources, constraints, etc. So it really depends on kind of the problem context. I don't think there's ever going to be one definition that we will all agree on. But there are a few out there, and I can distribute my personal favorites.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I have an article from an engineer who works in simulation, and he has 100 definitions just as simulation. Yeah. So yes, it's not a simple thing, but I also think that it's useful to have one that when you're working with someone to agree on what it is you're doing at the time, and then recognize that there are all those others that you could use. Thank you. Yeah, somebody else might like to ask a question.
I request other panel members to please ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question. You discussed about city level. You also discussed about neighborhood level. Each level, there is a huge difference of scale. So as a designer, how he or she should adjust to that respective scale?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit. So you broke up a little bit. Could you? Yeah.
Yeah. See, you discuss about city level. You also discuss about neighborhood level and a building level. Now each level is very different. The scale is very different.
Yeah.
So how designer can adjust himself for that each respective scale?
Okay. So again, interesting question. So what I don't have the image, but what these architects did is basically they created like a Lego-like sort of system or framework to be able to design a building. So it's basically like slats and floors and little furniture, etc., that you can then use to design a building. It depends on the outcome that you want. Do you want to be able to design an apartment? Do you want to see how a building looks in the middle of a neighborhood? What is it that you want? And to a certain extent, it also depends on the game setting or the physical constraints that you have. Sometimes you don't really. You might want to play this. So we played the city game. So we played this game usually in like large banquet halls, but sometimes you might want to take it to the place where you want to apply it. So we took it into we took these into like slums or different specific neighborhoods or industrial complexes and so on. And transporting a game is also like a constraint that you might have. I've played a couple of sessions of this game, and it's usually like 2 really large tables with bigger blocks of these size, so you can actually imagine this. There is this amazing movie called Synecdoche in New York, where he's trying to build New York in miniature, and he builds it in this amazing sort of a Broadway theater, so people can actually walk through the rivers of New York. It really depends on what you're trying to get your participants to imagine and what you're trying to get them to bring out of their mental models. Sometimes you might want to take them on an actual walk. We do that in Stockholm. So we just walk on the streets with these kinds of artifacts in their hands. We've played the city game with plastic cups. There's no specific limit, but I always go back to the same two questions. What am I trying to get out of the participants, and what do they recognize?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Claudia, you have any questions?
The only thing I was wondering is, how do you test the different levels of participant? If you design it for one group, it's okay, but if it's neutral and you have different groups, so how do you test it?
Mostly by trial and error. I mean, I don't think there is a good way. But with the domains that I work with, especially if they're fairly technical, then there is a certain amount of generalization and standardization that you can rely on. Traffic control rooms mostly look the same across the world. There is not too many differences there. It's only the map that you need to change. And it's the same, at least in healthcare. Most hospitals, etc., look roughly the same. I think there is like this temptation to make everything too complex and to say that everything is different. It's usually not. So there's always certain standardizations and generalizations that you can rely on, and basically try to have different levels of abstraction a little bit built in already. Design your game with certain amount of flexibility. So for example, in the city game that we are trying to look at, all you have to do is peel off these labels and attach new ones. So basically they're wooden blocks or cardboard blocks underneath, and the pink and the purple that you look at are basically labels that are stuck on, right? So there are certain things that you can do with artifacts like that. So the game material has to be designed in a clever way. But again, there are good guidelines from like board game design and so on that you can use.
So there's another question from one of my colleagues in Australia asking, do you think a game always has to have a simulation of some kind? And I guess I'd add the other way, does a simulation have a game of some kind?
So when I started sort of structuring this talk, the kind of hypothesis that I had was that a simulation cannot become a game, but a game can simulate something. So there is, and again, this is from a very sort of strict definition of what a simulation is, coming mostly from my background as a computer scientist. I would say no, a game doesn't always have to have a simulation of some kind. And I would actually argue that a simulation cannot be a game. Just because you're adding some interactive controls over a simulation. I know it's a provocative statement, but
we might have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
Yes. I see them as interconnected, and going back to Vishal's question earlier, for me, the dependencies that you've listed are the important ones. Who the players are, what's the level of fidelity that you want for the particular game. But for me, they all have to have some form of playing with something.
Yeah.
Therefore I think game has a simulation component in it, and simulation has a game component in it. through that element of play as much as anything.
I agree with you in principle, but again, I think I think we have a very, there's a temptation to also adopt a very loose definition of what play actually is. Like I was saying, if you take the simulation within Proto World, it's called Sumo, Simulation of Urban Mobility, and it has a very nice GUI and interface, so you can visualize it on your own. But that doesn't necessarily, the fact that you can change a few parameters for the simulation doesn't make it a game. So I think I've been struggling with that question for a while, and there is a temptation to adopt a very loose definition of what play actually means or what it constitutes. So there I might disagree with you, but in principle, I agree.
For a future conversation.
Yes.
And Vinod was asking whether you were looking for Hutzinger's definition of game.
No, there is this. No, it starts with B. I'm blanking out on the name. He has this definition of illusory goals and artificial constraints and so on. But those are, so Jesper Jules and the other one is usually what I try to use.
So you're saying games have illusory goals?
Yeah. I'm blanking out on who the person is. But it's again it's used a lot in entertainment gaming, not so much in our discipline. No, I try to stay. Sorry? No, Claudia, I try to stay out of the COVID mess. I know, even though it's the world's first complexity crisis, I kind of, I think there's already a lot of work and too much conversation there. We are, however, working on sort of modeling for the emergency care with a hospital here, using both agent-based models and machine learning. But so yeah, I stayed out of this COVID research.
Okay.
Any question from Namit Gupta?
Yes.
Sorry.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
One more question is there.
No, actually, my question was already asked, because I was also wondering that how really every game should have the simulation part into it. But Jayant has already answered that. So the question has been taken. Thank you.
Okay, then I think, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. I think we have attended a very wonderful session and very interesting presentation was there. And I want to thank the speaker, and for to propose words of thanks, I would like to invite founder of Mentis, Dr. Vinod Damlekar, sir. So please.
Okay, I'm not on the right page. I don't know. I missed a page somewhere. Then that was a fantastic program. You covered a lot of areas which we did not know. In finding the difference between abstraction and fidelity and what is reality, I think you brought us close to what was called what we familiarly know as modeling. You showed us a number of games. I think some of us will be interested to go back to those games and play them just to feel what exactly is the play experience. Many of us do not look upon simulations and games as an approach to solving problems. I wish we could do that more often than what we are doing today. But I think perhaps a presentation such as yours, I think will do that. Thank you very much for speaking to all of us. And like Rupali said earlier, you are the first Indian to speak to all of us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for everybody else to participate. There are too many to be named here. There are organizers as well who have done a wonderful job of making this happen across. We are doing this since October, and I hope we will take it longer and at least advocate the use of simulations and games in a big way. Although we, of course, I suspect this our smaller objective is the conference. Yes, I said smaller. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for coming. And I hope everybody will be here for the next webinar, as also September.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Now, I would also request everybody to register for this forthcoming ISAGA. And anyone who wants to conduct a workshop, they can send the proposal so that it could be included. I think Elizabeth is already, she has already mentioned that she will be conducting some workshop.
I'm sorry, you broke up with.
So are you going to conduct any workshop during the ISAGA?
I have plans to put one in. Yes, I have the flyer. So yes, certainly. I think there'll be a couple from Australia at least. I hope so. We're publicising it through our Simulation Australasia network as well.
Okay. Yeah, it will be there. It will be included in the program. So if there is anyone else who would like to conduct a workshop, so they are welcome. And others should also register and send papers to us.
Thank you.
And one good news is that Springer has accepted to publish the proceedings.
Ah, good.
Therefore, there is also an attraction for those who want to write papers and submit for ISAGA.
Yes.
Okay, now we'll be meeting. Yeah, we'll be meeting again in the next webinar. What is the date, Jigyasu?
24th April, sir.
And who is this speaker?
Dr. Tyagi.
Ah.
Okay, Tyagi. Oh, very good. So
Yes.
we'll be meeting 1 week later.
I think.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, all participants. I request all participants to please fill the feedback form as mentioned in the chat box, in the link given below in the chat box. Please fill the feedback form for certificate. And I thanks again for all the eminent panel members and speaker and participants. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Jayant, for
Thanks.
that lead
Bye.
on burnout suits.
Yeah.
The grasshopper. That's going to be fun. I'm going to go after it in a half an hour from now. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry for finishing so early.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think it was a nice session. But you can see the interactivity with and the questions that are coming up in so many corners. And hope to see all of you again in the next webinar. Tyagi, as you know, will have lots of fun things for us. I don't know what they are. And that mystery is, I think, good. Thank you all.